Hello and welcome to the Big Yearning podcast. We are two life coaches who really enjoy meaningful discussions about big questions. Our work and our lives have been shaped by these questions, and they've taken us to some amazing places in our lives and within ourselves. We all long for things. We all carry big yearnings in our hearts, and over the next 45 minutes, we hope to touch on some of these yearnings and perhaps give you some ideas or insights to help you be clearer about what you long for and how to get it. Hello everyone, and welcome to episode 8 of the Big Yearning podcast. My name is Neil.
My name's Alexander.
And we very much welcome you here today for both existing listeners who have heard the podcast before and also for new listeners. And as myself and Alexander often say at the beginning of an episode, we very much welcome your feedback. So if there's anything that you hear in the podcast today that you would like to give us some feedback on, we very much welcome that. We will be giving you our contact details at the end of the podcast. But before further ado, let's check in. Alexander, how are you today?
Cheers, mate. I'm good. I'm properly, solidly good. Just a number of things have sort of come together for me in the last couple of weeks. And I've just made this real decision that I'm just going to focus on feeling good for the next while. I've had a number of sort of little health wobbles this year. I've had some sort of personal dramas. There's the background stuff, the 2020 stuff, worrying about the virus, worrying, looking at the big picture, watching the news, watching stuff about the news, and just, how crazy everything is going, anti-masker protests and all this bollocks. But a number of things have sort of come together. I mean, so one was, I was just flicking through YouTube and this thing came on and it really just quickly outlined the sort of the Rupert Murdoch approach to whipping up everybody's fears and stresses and anxieties, and how that's really taken hold of our our attention. That's how the news works now. And there's this whole industry around manipulating our feelings. So that happened. A friend then told me about a documentary he'd watched on Netflix, which was all about how social media has sort of manipulates our brains and is really derailing us culturally as well as personally. And as we will come on to say, this podcast is a week behind schedule because we recorded an episode. It was such a challenging topic and it brought up so much stuff that actually when we listened back to it, we were like, no, it's not good enough. We can do better than that. And I've had to really dive into some very deep stuff. And a combination of those things and just a number of other things in my personal life have just sort of come together. And I thought, no, I am in control of my experience. I can choose the shape that the next little bit of my life is going to go. And I just choose to feel good. I choose to feel happy about just being alive, about just this experience I'm having. So, and that's genuinely, it really has landed. It can sound like that's just a momentary flyaway thing, but just these number of things that have just sort of said, well, look, this isn't about allowing my experience to be tailored and manipulated by massive invisible agencies, and this isn't about just constantly picking up sources of stress and worrying and being, in a state of tension. I can just choose to be relaxed, at peace, fully aware of all the challenges. I've just been to a cafe and I had to wear my mask while I was ordering and that whole surreal thing. And there's still fear and there's still worry about things, but I can choose my sort of background state and I choose for it to be good. So I really am feeling great. Other things worth mentioning, I've spoken about my 5-year plan on the podcast a few times and how important that is to me. And that's all coming together and that feels sort of rich and challenging and nourishing. And I just feel really grateful to my friends and people who have sort of challenged me or contributed or I've been able to talk that over with. So feeling good about that. I promised in the last episode that I would unveil the new title of the book. The title of the book at the moment, if you still want to pick up a copy on Amazon at the moment, is 12 Words That Will Set You Free. But as listeners, I'm sure, remember, I was challenged to go back and rethink that. So The new title is Deep Joy. And the subtitle is 12 words that will unlock your potential and help you build an amazingly fulfilling life. So that feels good. That feels exciting. And I've hired a graphic designer to start working on a cover design for that. And that feels really good. So yeah, I think all of that comes together. The challenges and the opportunities to dive deep over the last couple of weeks, and just a few big things moving on in my life. I just feel great. So that's where I'm coming from today.
Good. Thank you very much, Alexander. Okay, so let me think. How am I? Generally, I feel good in this moment. And I just want to echo something that you said. Again, I should have said this in the introduction, but I overlooked it. And that is that, as Alexander said, this episode is over a week late. And that is because the first one we recorded wasn't up to standard. It wasn't something that we were happy to go out as an episode. And yeah, so we've been talking between ourselves a lot about the material for this and how it's impacted on us personally. And for me, that's been a good experience, doing the podcast, and all the topics that we discuss can bring up stuff. That's kind of real life. We do get impacted by that. So hopefully, what we're going to talk about today will, I hope, come across as more coherent than the last one. And I think we've kind of gathered our ideas and our thoughts, and as well our feelings about it, to offer you something that is hopefully beneficial for you. So yes, I've been quite consumed with podcast topic this week and thinking about it and processing it. Another thing that's been really good for me in the last sort of couple of weeks is that I've started doing a bit of work at a local school for children and young people with learning difficulties. And it's been a real joy. It's been a really, really lovely thing to do. The kids and the staff are really lovely. There's a really strong sense of pastoral care at this school, and without so much of a narrow emphasis, if you like, on academic achievement. The care and the sort of well-being and the social lives of the children and young people are just as important. And that's been a bit of a tonic for me, Alexander, because I spent most of my life working in the public sector, mainly in the NHS, but also in other education settings as well, and found them to be environments which kind of wear me out, grind me down, burn me out, don't value me. So that's been really, really lovely. It's been a really lovely tonic. Anything else? Yeah, I'd just like to echo what you said about. It's interesting that what you said about the news and how that kind of filters into you. And you mentioned that documentary, Social Dilemma, I think it's called.
Yeah, that's the one.
I started watching a bit of that, and for me, it was really illuminating, the very fact that these former senior employees of all these social media companies almost kind of going rogue in terms of saying, giving some of their misgivings about the work that they've been involved in. So that for me, I'm going to finish watching that this weekend. And I actually stopped watching the news at the beginning of lockdown, really. I won't say much more about that, but we could always do an episode on social media and stuff. But I just found that, in short, it was making me more jangled, more anxious, and a lot of the stuff I was seeing and hearing, I was powerless to do anything about. So I switched off from it and made a decision to put my energies into things that I could affect change on and I could have some control over. So it's interesting that you mentioned that. Thank you.
I didn't know about the school thing. That sounds really exciting and fun.
Yeah, it's really lovely. I mean, I smile as I talk about it, but it's really, really heartwarming, and it kind of just restores my faith in humanity a bit.
Yeah.
It's lovely. Really, really nice.
Good.
Yeah. Okay. Right. We're going to go on to discuss the topic for today, which is, what does healing look like for men? How does that show up? And just generally a discussion around around healing as a man. Okay, so why this topic? Well, for myself, I've been interested in what masculinity is for many, many years, really, as long as I can remember. What does it mean to be a man, and what does this mean in terms of my identity as a human being? It seems to me, and Alexander, when we've talked about this, that issues of gender are very up in society and in our culture at the moment. You only have to look at the phenomenon of social movements like Me Too and the campaign by transgender people for equal rights, just to see evidence of that. So it seems like a good time to have an episode on masculinity and what it is to be a man. And when I was thinking about this and also talking with Alexander, we only had to kind of recall things like, suicide being the largest cause of death for men under 45. To know that for us as men, this is a topic that is really important. Men's health and well-being and psychological health and mental health is really, really important. Lastly, by way of introduction on this, we're very aware that this is it will certainly be a very sensitive issue for us to discuss. So much so that we had misgivings or apprehensions about the first recording we did of this episode. So that's one thing. But also to say, we're very aware that even now in our society and culture, gender roles are very, very narrowly and stereotypically prescribed. The whole nature of the debate is very binary. And sometimes I even think that we're kind of hostages to language in this, in as much as the very narrowness of the language that we use limits the scope to which we can think and imagine what it is to be a man, what it is to be a woman, what it is to be neither, what it is to be a mixture of both, what it means to define your own gender and sexual identity. So as we talk about this, we try to be sensitive around those sort of stereotypes and the language that we use. Now, the way that we're doing this episode is similar to our very usual format. We're going to take 3 questions, and each of us is going to respond to those in turn. Okay, so the first question that we're going to tackle is, what challenges have we faced around being a man? And I'm going to invite Alexander to kick us off with this.
Oof, okay, here we go. All right, challenges that I have faced around being a man. I'll briefly touch on early life stuff about feeling like I was a very sensitive child, couldn't really handle loud noises, didn't feel very tough and physically resilient. My father was a very physically tough guy. He was a self-made man, but he was also big on DIY and mechanics and fixing things and building things, and I often felt like I couldn't really keep up. And I went to a all-boys public school where I was a bit sort of socially ostracized. That was a really painful chapter of my life. And I think just those kinds of things early in life just left me really baffled, just very confused. And I think that for the longest time, I switched off the question around my manhood, my masculinity. I felt quite lacking. I felt like I probably wasn't a proper man. And I felt like I was probably getting it wrong. And then, my life has involved a lot of reflective stuff around philosophy and culture and psychology. So I felt like I realized early on that a lot of traditional ideas of manhood, certainly to me, but increasingly, I think, a kind of shared thing, they're quite repulsive and they're deeply unethical, immoral, and cruel in a lot of ways. There's a lot of stuff in there around violence, whether that is physical violence or whether that is a violent approach to your life. There's roles for traditional men of attacking and subjugating women. Domestic violence is still a huge issue in our culture, but also abusing and neglecting children. There's things around the privilege and security that men get to enjoy that women don't. There is a long history of conquest and abuse and cruelty. And for me, there was just this sort of realization that a lot of the traditional roles for men are bound up with a sense of shame. That I don't want to be involved in that. But what does that leave me was very much my kind of question. What is left that is good? So another thing that I sort of encountered along my life is, I moved through a lot of healing and personal development kind of circles, whether that's in a kind of academic environment or whether that's in the sort of the hippie towns that I lived in Devon. And I saw a lot of problems there as well. I saw a lot of sort of twisting of the privileges men tend to enjoy in our culture to become to be warped into something which in those circles to me felt often manipulative or unsound, or I just felt kind of slimy. Now I live in Brighton. It's a very modern town. It's very it's got a very young population generally, very transient. There's a large gay population. There's a lot of sort of what I would call kind of a metrosexual thing amongst young people, very rewriting the rules and doing it their own way. But that also comes with it the Tinder dating culture. And so a lot of my experiences of manhood in a more urban city environment have just felt inconsistent and quite shallow. Men who on one day just want to have sex, just want to pick up a date and hook up, and then on other days are left really wanting deep connection, fears around commitment, and masking those fears by sort of constantly just moving on and never settling, never committing. So sort of exposed to all these different things, I think my main experience of manhood and masculinity has just been confusion. Of the paradigms that are offered to me, there's always wholesome bits of all of them, and yet never really feeling like I can just adopt that model. Never feeling like I can adopt traditional British manhood in the sort of what I think of as quite old and nasty sort of model. Not being able to feel like I sit with a kind of new age model for manhood. And now living in Brighton and hearing a lot of stories from women around how men behave on Tinder, not really feeling like I can settle with that either. So for me, an ongoing experience of confusion has been my experience of masculinity and manhood, really.
Thank you, Alexander. Thank you particularly for being really honest and just saying confusion, Mm-hmm. There's a couple of things that you talked about. You asked the question, what is it that is left that is good? Mm. Yeah. And, I really hope that in what we talk about for the remainder of the podcast, we can unearth some of the stuff that might be good. And then the last thing that you said about you're not satisfied with any one model. It's something about, you wanting to take bits from different models. And I suppose for me, my answer to my sort of response to that is yes, play not just to you, but almost rhetorically, yes, play around with, different models that we see and take those bits that work for us as men and reject those bits that don't work for us as men. So, yeah, thank you. Okay. And I think there'll be quite a lot of overlap here and as there often is.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. So for me, with that question, what challenges have I faced around being a man? I think for me, overarchingly, those challenges have been around identity and authenticity. And I think they have shown up and in some ways continue to show up in the questions, who am I and can I be myself? So part of that is growing up and even now still, I struggle to find adequate male role models. I think I experience a lack of elder men in our society. And I think that, growing up, I would have loved to have, a man or men around me to show me the way, in inverted commas, whatever that might look like. So I think yeah, I concur. My experience has been similar to you, I think, in some degree of confusion or uncertainty or not knowingness or a lack of something kind of strong and solid and reliable to kind of get hold of in terms of being a man. And similar to you, I'll just give a little bit of kind of background context to my life and in terms of being a man, being a boy. I grew up in a very, very traditional home in terms of the gender roles. This is growing up in the 1970s. My dad was an engineer at a local factory. He was a very traditional man in terms of being the provider, going out to work each day. It was my mum who did all the childcare for us three kids. And she ran the home, so to speak. So that was my kind of formative template of masculinity. So within that, there was nothing alternative. There was nothing outside of the stereotype. And then at school, I went to a grammar school. It was mixed in terms of so boys and girls. And I found quite a strong outlet and identity and a lot of safety in sport, really. Football and cricket, probably mainly football. So again, very traditionally sort of gendered activities. And I think to a degree, you know, those activities kept me out of trouble. They helped me fit in and probably stopped me from being bullied. When I was at grammar school, I saw some really vicious boy-on-boy bullying that was really horrific. And I myself was quite a small and frail child, but I could get my way around a football field quite adequately. So like I said, that did kind of save me. And I used my sense of humour to get by, to kind of duck and dive. So there was quite a strong sense of, you know, having to survive it and endure it rather than enjoy it. So in terms of these questions, who am I as a male? You know, that was all very, very prescribed. You know, that question was really answered for the society and culture around me. In terms of there is one particular challenge I would like to mention, which has been very strong for me and also for a number of other men I've met, and that is to do with body image and how men feel about their bodies and how they think they look and all of that kind of stuff.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so I just tell a quick story here, which made me smile when I remembered it. When I was 20, I started my nurse training as a psychiatric nurse. And I was speaking one day to a friend's mum, and I just chatting generally, and I said, "Oh, I'm a psychiatric nurse." And she replied, "You're too small and slight to be a psychiatric nurse." And it was really interesting because my judgment there was that she was working with a preconceived stereotype of psychiatric nurse as some kind of burly jailer type man with big set of keys hanging off his belt. And nowhere within that perception or that idea was the possibility that actually I might have some of the qualities, patience, sensitivity, thoughtfulness, empathy, the capacity to listen, that might actually make me a very good psychiatric nurse. So it was really interesting just to be, you know, confronted with this kind of stereotypical kind of view of, muscular, big man to do a particular job. And that kind of, you know, that speaks to a kind of body image or, you know, ideas about the male body. And that, you know, I've always had a kind of sensitivity around, you know, what does the body of a man look like, or what should it look like? How should it be? How should I cultivate it? Is there anything I should get rid of? Is there anything I should accentuate, you know? And like, as I said, I was quite a slight and sort of frail child. And, you know, particularly in the last few years when I began meeting up with more men, the degree of kind of shame around bodies and the physicality that a lot of men have is really strong. You know, discomfort, dissatisfaction, that can, you know, just wreak havoc with self-confidence and a sense of being self-assured in the world, you know, having to kind of come up to scratch with this kind of there's a particular kind of muscular male physique or being tall or whatever, or all of that kind of stuff. And, for me, it goes without saying that if a man, or to own this, if I don't kind of work on those issues, then they just get played out in areas of, my sexual identity, my sexual behavior, how I am in the world, how I am in relation to women, and how I am in relation to children, for example. So for me, that's been a really, really big one, to which I don't have any answers to, other than to acknowledge that it's an ongoing process of kind of self-discovery and kind of sharing with other men and women as well, because it can't rule out, it's really important to kind of include the kind of female perspective on this kind of stuff as well. So, I'll stop there with that.
Great. I mean, there's a lot there. Thank you very much, Neil. I don't really think I have anything to add to that. I just, really appreciate your honesty and lots of little insights there. Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, so second question that we're taking on today is, what solutions / responses have we found to these challenges that we've both just talked about? So over to you, Alexander, with that.
Cheers, mate. Okay. So one thing I see a lot in my work as a coach is that we all emerge from childhood with some sort of with some scars, with some wounds, with some challenges to face. Our parents, by and large, are always doing their best, but who the hell knows how to parent? So there's plenty of stuff that I can take from my childhood that is like, that's stuff I've got to work with, and that's challenges. But one thing I absolutely got, one blessing and one skill that I absolutely got really drummed into me was emotional communication. My mum was training and then working as a psychotherapist. We were discussing emotions almost constantly, and I remember bringing home a girlfriend one time, and after she had been around us for a while, we'd gone apart. I think we'd gone for a walk, and she just said, "You guys talk about your feelings all the time." So that was a big part of my childhood, and I do feel like that gave me the blessing that I started asking a lot of questions quite early on, and I certainly had a whole set of tools that I haven't seen present in a lot of men that I've met. I often have this experience when I'm sitting with my male friends. We're having a great time. We're laughing and joking about stuff, and I love these men to bits. I think they're fantastic. They're my good friends, and yet I don't really feel like I know how they feel. And often I don't feel like we've ever really had a conversation about feelings, or we've only really talked about feelings when there's been something really, there's been a crisis point where they've just absolutely needed to share there and then. And yet I feel like talking about my feelings quite regularly, and I feel really comfortable with it. So I was able to kind of start digging into things really early that I feel like a lot of men are kind of aren't allowed to talk about or feel or experience. I feel like a lot of men just don't have the vocabulary and don't really have the experience of voicing their feelings, voicing their experience in any kind of rich and deep way. And I think this begins really early on in life. And I know that, Neil, you and I have talked about this, and I'm going to leave you to talk more fully about that because you can say it far more eloquently than I can. But there is something about the education of boys that stops them being able to express themselves emotionally. So I had that as a blessing. I really do feel like early on in life, I was able to start noticing some of the problems around traditional models of manhood and masculinity. And so I was able to kind of really jump into this with both feet. In terms of answers, I've really been inspired by a few men in my life, and I think I went out looking for inspiring men. And I've been able to meet some in my actual real life. I mentioned Roy Dory in our last podcast, the rogue Baptist minister, who was a huge inspiration to me in my 20s, and also Peter Vardy, who was a lecturer at Heathrop College, where I studied philosophy. I lived with a man called Barney for a while. He was a businessman, quite tough, but also very jolly, and really opened my eyes to both the excitement and challenge and boisterousness of the business world, but also he was a voice for the right wing of politics who I could actually connect with and who I could actually identify with what he was saying. So that was really inspiring for me. Mac, the founder of Embercombe, has often been inspiring to me, and Jonathan, who trained me in things about coaching and the kind of the subtle speaking, healing approaches. So I've been blessed with them, but also, a whole bunch of men from fiction. I really do believe that men, that we can draw inspiration and ideas about finding our identity as a man from the world of fiction. So I'm really into sci-fi. So I've got to say, early life, Jean-Luc Picard from Star Trek was a huge inspiration for me. Later, the new version of Battlestar Galactica, Admiral Adama, still sits up there as one of my, there we go, solid manhood. And watching The West Wing, when that was a thing, President Bartlett from that, just very inspiring, very intelligent, very incisive. And a real thread there of people who will stand up for values and morals and for what is right. And that, I think, became a running thread for me in defining and finding my own masculinity. And I'm going to come on to say a bit more about that later. Overall, I would say that my response to the challenges of, in my case, just being baffled and confused, has just been to sit in the discomfort, unwilling to kind of fall back on the old models. And sit with, the what I see as the violence and the hostility and the shame of the old models, not falling fully into the new models, believing that the truth of me and the truth of my manhood and the truth of what we are as men is so much deeper than those models, and just holding my space in between. Just saying, okay, I am in discomfort, but I believe the truth can be found here. So I'm not going to step into those easy answers. I'm going to keep asking questions. I'm going to keep exposing myself to, all the challenges that come up, all the ways that my female friends point out awful things that have been done to them by men over the years. And I have to kind of integrate that into my understanding of what manhood is, and allow myself to be confused and take in all the information I can. But there's something about being in that confused space that over time, all the years that I'm doing it, I have become very, very strong. So now, to my surprise, in most spaces that I'm in, I am the strong person in the room. And I've held myself with that discomfort for so long that things are beginning to kind of slot into place a little bit, and there's some kind of integration happening. And there's been this ferocious strength that has been unlocked by being unwilling to just settle for an easy answer. And that's also happened physically. I've spent so much time in the gym and so much time training in martial arts that I also feel physically strong and centered. And I now feel almost qualified to say the odd thing, actually saying this is where we can be going with this. So overall, I think that my solution has simply been, no, I am not going to compromise. I am not going to settle for that easy answer. I'm not going to buy into your model or your idea of what manhood should be. And I'm just going to sit in the discomfort and take in all the information I can. That's been my main response, I think.
Thank you, Alexander. Great. Thank you. I think there's a lot to be said for having the courage to sit with confusion and sit with uncertainty and not kind of force the issue.
I think it's wonderful.
Yeah, so good for you in that. I mean, I think making the assumption here that that kind of reflects a lot of our kind of work as coaches. The client has to kind of, with our support, has to kind of come to their own conclusions kind of naturally in a way that evolves without being forced into any particular position. And knowing how uncomfortable that can be and how sort of like horrible it can be to sit in a place of confusion and not knowing and discomfort.
I think often our job is to witness them in their discomfort and just sort of reassure them that it's okay to be uncomfortable.
Yeah, exactly. I got quite envious when you were sort of reeling off a whole list of names of men that you found inspiring. I mean, you had a little bit of a chat about this last night, and I kind of really struggled to sort of think of anyone. And the person that kind of came to mind for me, I don't know whether this is interesting or not, but it's Ray Mears.
Ray's brilliant.
Yeah, there's something for me about Ray Mears that he's strong and respectful and humble. So I just have this image of him kind of going around the world, meeting lots of different people in different indigenous tribes, and he doesn't kind of impose himself as a Westerner. He's kind of strong and quite centered in himself and willing to learn, willing to kind of receive, but also kind of strong and got a lot of self-knowledge around it. Yeah, there's a task, isn't it, for listeners to think of kind of men that they found inspiring. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Okay. So for me, what solutions or responses have I found to the challenges that I spoke about earlier? I think for me, starting off with this, it's important to say that some of my responses to the challenges I spoke about started out more as coping strategies, which then gave me the experiential knowledge I needed to turn mere coping strategies, which may have had a degree of dysfunction in them, into attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors which were more authentic, conscious, and functional. So,
exciting.
Yeah. So one of the things, the first thing I kind of want to say here is, in terms of way of coping or response, one of the first things that came to me was when I was about 11 or 12, I became really aware of how different I was from my brother, who I perceived as having more of a masculine identity compared to me. And I remember consciously at the time thinking, I can't be like that. Now, that wasn't just a kind of gender thing or masculinity thing. It was as much a case of sibling positioning and, how can I get attention for me, as it was anything to do with gender specifically. But what that caused me to do was that I cultivated an identity that was consciously more quiet, softer, more sensitive characteristics, those characteristics that one would more stereotypically identify as feminine. And looking back at this time, I don't know whether that response to cultivate that side of me was simply my natural personality coming out, or how much it was a suppression of what might have been more stereotypically masculine traits. But interestingly, that led me to work from the age of 20 in predominantly female environments. And I found that kind of way of being that I found that I kind of cultivated or evolved, rather, being maybe a little bit more feminine in terms of my certain qualities. I was really happy working in predominantly female environments. So that'd be primarily nursing, but also education and early years settings. So for a number of years, I was really happy with that. But then in terms of coming back to the question, what solutions or responses have I found to those challenges? I have to say that really started with me going into therapy. So my first kind of go at therapy was in my early 20s. And I've probably been in therapy, I think, 5 or 6 times in my adult life since then. And it's almost a given, really, that the self-reflection that occurs in therapy, naturally led me to think about myself as a man and my identity. And, I picked over a number of those sort of early years experiences that I've already mentioned. And where that led me was to men's groups. And doing therapeutic work within men's groups. And I first had a go at, went to a men's group, I think in my early 30s, and then sort of left it for many years, and then have revisited men's groups in the last sort of 4 years. And I was very, very, I was very skeptical, quite skittish around this. I had a lot of stereotypical views, judgmental views about what men's groups are like and how sort of macho they might be. I told myself a story that I'm not the kind of man that would go to a men's group. But gradually I kind of found myself going into those forums. And what's been really good about working in men's groups is that I've been able to really challenge a lot of those sort of cultural shoulds of masculinity that I've been carrying around with me my whole life. Things for me like have to be outward orientated, have to be constructing, building, making things out in the world. I have to be tough. I have to be a financial success. I have to have a career. I have to be a provider. All of those things I found somewhat of a safe haven, I guess, Alexander, to begin to question some of those things. And that's really worked. That's really worked with me. Now, that stuff may not work for everyone. But for me, amongst other things of having individual male friends who aren't involved in men's groups, also, my female partner has been really helpful in all of this. So for me, it's been piecing together a kind of a number of different safe havens, I suppose. I'll use that phrase again, in which I can explore, what it is to be a man and the ongoing challenges of that. So that's me for that one. Any thoughts on that, or want to move on, Alexander?
Again, I don't think I have any questions or comments about that, Neil. I really appreciate the clarity you bring to this, and I do like hearing you talk about sort of your experience of men's groups and things, because it's so it's quite alien to me. Having spent a bit of time in those kinds of groups, and it never really worked for me. While you and I have been talking about this topic over the last couple of weeks and unpacking this and trying to talk about it, I have really appreciated hearing your insights into what those groups have brought you. So, thank you for bringing that.
You're welcome. Thank you. Okay, we are on to our third and final question that we're going to chew the cud on. And that question is, what would we like to say to other men? Okay, you want to go first, Alexander?
Yeah. Okay. So this one required quite a lot of soul searching and working out what can I meaningfully say in the few minutes that I have in the podcast. So I've condensed it down to three things. So the first one is really simple. There are answers for men, but they aren't the old answers. They aren't the easy answers. They aren't somebody else's answer. They're your answer. And there is hope. If you ever reach a point as a man where you've reached a moment in your life and you feel there is no hope and there's nowhere to go, and you've reached the end of your tether, I call what I do, my career, I call my approach deep coaching, because I believe if you reach an impasse, go deeper. And really that brings me on to the second thing I want to say, which is, for a lot of men, their answers, the really interesting stuff, the stuff where they really get to grips with their masculinity and their response to these questions. And okay, there's the old models and there's a few bits of that I like, but there's all that horrible stuff. And then there's these other models and I want to play around with them. And there's these books, there's a huge number of great books that are available for men. There's men's groups, there's conversations with other men, there's resources online. But all the really interesting stuff happens after we've covered the basics. And I'm going to call it basics, even though, for some people, this is really challenging advanced stuff, because there's more afterwards. But there really is, it's really important to begin grappling with the fundamentals of who am I, what am I, how do I work? Emotional vocabulary and understanding. How do my feelings work? What are my feelings? Where are they coming from? What are they trying to tell me? How do I interact with them in a way that's actually going to help me? Becoming physically embodied, really connecting deeply with my physical presence and my body, and moving my consciousness out of my mind and feeling my physical presence. Mindfulness, so that I'm not constantly confused and taken off center by the babble of my brain. Understanding my core values. What do I stand for? What's my ethical framework? What is my grounding in the choices that I make? And facing some of the really hard truths about what our culture does to men and what it provides for men, the privileges that exist for men, and what does our culture do to women and what does it do to children? Really facing up to that and having to kind of swallow those bitter pills. Things like that, they're the fundamentals, and they are work that I believe is waiting for every man to engage with. Because only when you've grappled with that stuff for a while, made some headway, opened up those kinds of skills and those kinds of understandings, does the really interesting stuff come along. And I use the term being centered or centering, and that's where the interesting stuff comes in for me. Once we understand basically what am I, who am I, and to a certain extent, why am I, then there is the becoming a still point in your life. There's something about that, something about grounding and feeling a sense of centeredness and wholeness and kind of a deep understanding and strength. And for me, that is where my experience of manhood and masculinity ends up. I feel centered. I still feel confused to a certain extent, and I still can feel overwhelmed, and I can still feel strong emotions in vulnerable moments. But there is this centeredness to my being. But for me, I could only find that once I'd done what I'm calling the basics. And the third thing I wanted to say to men, any men who are listening to this, or any women who are thinking about men in their lives, but this goes out to men, is if you become a man who has a few answers, but not all the answers, but you grapple with the stuff a bit, you've kind of made some headway, then I just really invite you to be patient with other men. Definitely don't push your answers onto them, because in my experience, men hate having other people's answers pushed onto them. But we just stand with other men. Just be with them. Offer them love and brotherhood as much as they're willing to accept and as much as you feel comfortable. Because for a lot of men, we are feeling alone and we are feeling ill-equipped. And so many of us haven't even begun to do this work. And it can be very easy for men to simply feel alone for a very long time and for it then to become too much.
Yes.
So I think my main invitation is, if you feel like you're a man who has even the merest grapple on the edge of some of these answers, then look around you, look for the men who you care about and stand with them.
Thank you, Alexander. Yeah, that's lovely. Thank you. Yeah, I'm touched, as you were talking about just then about men not being alone, just kind of took me back to, that bit in the introduction about, rates of male suicide, and how that's a logical kind of endpoint for a lot of men, unfortunately. Too many men. Thank you. A couple of things that you said that I'd just like to touch on, and I thought were great. What you're saying about emotional literacy, and you talked in your opening bit about being fortunate to have kind of grown up in a family where that was kind of de rigueur, really.
Yeah.
But and also, I think you're really spot on when you talk about this thing about being physically embodied. I mean, I really spoke to me. I think there is something about given the kind of the charge that there is around male physicality and what that means and what a bad press that has in many, many, many cultures over a long period of time. For me, what a wonderful thing it can be to find a sense of male physical embodiedness that first and foremost feels okay, more than okay for that man, but also feels okay for the people around that man. I think that's really, really, really spot on. Thank you. My response to what would I like to say to other men echoes a lot of what you said, actually. I've termed it maybe a little bit differently, but there's a lot of similarity. So my first thing would be to ask men to reflect on their own personal history of masculinity, including their early years. Now, you don't have to get all sort of psychoanalytic about this, but for me, it's been really important to go back and think, okay, what really shaped me as a child, as a young boy, and then growing up? What have been the significant turning points in my life as a man? What male role models were there for you? And really interestingly, mate, just as you were talking, I've been thinking about, there was a particular nurse who I met when I was 20. This guy called Mike, and he just was really strong, centered, gentle. So that's for me, coming back to that sort of persona of someone like Ray Mears, in some ways, as we talk, and this has just come to me now, it's like, that's what I aspire to, Alexander, that blend of strength and softness, I suppose, at core. Yes. So yeah, reflect on your own personal history of masculinity. Ask yourself those questions like you yourself, Alexander, have just mentioned. And then the other thing for me, again, which you mentioned, about you talk about standing with other men. And for me, the way I kind of say that is listen to the stories of other men. And if you can, try and suspend your judgment when other men are telling you their stories. Okay, I've learned a great deal from listening to the stories of other men, sitting with them. What I find is that in a safe space, men will often drop their macho facades. They will drop their adopted personas, and common themes that I hear men talk about are, growing up with emotionally unavailable fathers, sometimes similar in terms of their mothers as well. Talking about how they had to learn to be tough, not allowed to cry. I see a lot of them being driven by the unmet needs of a little boy inside them that just kind of runs amok, kind of unconsciously. Given the opportunity for men to share in a safe space, I see an awful lot of vulnerability and rawness. I see the pressure of men trying to live up to some illusory, imagined ideal of what it is to be a man. And, I see a lot of men traumatized through very punishing school experiences, which can be incredibly cruel and really shape and scar men for their whole life. And also seeing men or listen to men tell stories about being boxed into narrow job roles, the job of provider. And so for me, like you say, it's about kind of questioning all of this stuff and really questioning it deeply. And in doing, and as I listen to the stories of other men, I find commonality with their stories. And it's kind of like, as you were talking about earlier on, Alexander, it's like I can select bits of stories of men that I hear that kind of chime with me, and I can run with that and then work with that and, make a time to speak with that man or those men further. So for me, that really, really helps me to bring me out of that realm of confusion or uncertainty or the huge paradoxes I find in terms of kind of what it is to be a man and male identity. But for me, the key thing, what I've learned about listening to the stories of men, how that serves me, is that it's only then that I can sort of begin to disentangle and make sense of all the different factors and influences that have contributed to shaping and sculpting me as a man. And that's important because then that gives me some conscious choice about the identity I adopt as a man, as opposed to wearing a whole load of social and cultural overlays. So, yeah, my parting shot would be listen to the stories of men and see if you can listen without judgment.
Love it. Yeah.
Thank you.
I mean, yeah, that listening to the stories of other men, that's really, the point where I was listing all these sort of men who have inspired me. I think a big part of what I was doing there was I was listening to them and trying to understand why these men felt different to others. But then if I think about my, male friends, every conversation that I have with a male friend, with a man where the conversation drops below the surface, I learn.
Yeah.
I realize all the things that I don't know and all the ways that I was indoctrinated or all the ways that I was educated and all the bits that were missing from my education. And it's an opportunity to learn. It's a new source of information. Yeah, it does. It holds up a mirror and says, look, here's some stuff that you need to know. So I think that's beautiful. Thank you.
It's been a joy, this one. Joy to do it. Thank you, Alexander. And I really, really hope that the listeners have benefited in some way from what we've had to say. We are pretty much up for time now. Like I said at the beginning, we love your feedback. If there is anything you'd like to catch up with me and Alexander about, then you can get in touch with us. Please feel free to do so. Alexander, how is it best for people to get in touch with you?
Oh, best way to reach me, hop onto Instagram and search for deep_coaching. You'll see a little picture of my face. Give me a follow and drop me a message. Would love to hear from you.
Okie doke, thank you. And the best way to get in touch with me is through my Facebook page, which is Coaching for Life Froome, all one big long word. Okay, so the last thing to say is that apart from thank you very much for listening, just to let you folks know that our next topic in a couple of weeks' time will be how to ask for help in an empowering way. So we very much look forward to welcoming you to that. But for now, it is cheerio from me.
And thank you and goodbye from me.
And we will hopefully see you next time. Bye-bye.
Cheers, guys. Bye-bye.